A man waist-deep in snow dragged a sled behind him, a rope knotted around his waist cutting into frozen cloth, his legs shaking with each step across the empty Dakota prairie. On the sled, a woman lay wrapped in every blanket the family owned, her face the color of old wax, her breathing a wet rattle that carried no further than the wind took it. 3 small shapes huddled around her, silent. The silence was worse than crying. He stopped. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel. The arithmetic was finished 20 miles to town, and his body had nothing left. Then he looked up. A single thread of smoke rose against the gray sky. Thin, steady, impossible. He turned the sled toward it. Somewhere beneath that smoke, a woman sat alone in a cabin. Everyone had called the Fool's Fort. Watching her fire consume wood she was running out of. 8 months earlier, they had laughed at her. Nobody was laughing now. January 1881. The temperature had fallen past the point where numbers carried meaning. Somewhere below 30 degrees under zero, the air stopped feeling like air. It became something else entirely. A living hostility that burned exposed skin within seconds, that turned breath into ice crystals before it left the mouth, that made the simple act of inhaling feel like swallowing broken glass. The prairie stretched in every direction, white beyond white, an ocean of snow so vast that the horizon dissolved into the sky. There was no line between earth above. There was no landmark, no tree, no fence post, no structure of any kind. Just white, endless, killing white. Through this emptiness moved a shape, a man, waist deep in snow, dragging something behind him, a sled, rough built from scrap lumber, piled with blankets. Beneath those blankets lay Bishish, her breathing shallow, her face the color of old wax. Behind her, 3 small shapes huddled together under every piece of fabric the family owned. They had stopped crying an hour ago. That silence was worse than the crying. Henry Fisk had left his cabin 4 hours earlier. The cabin that was supposed to shelter his family through winter. The cabin he had built in 18 days the previous August, following the same pattern every settler in Dakota Territory followed. Single-wall construction. Logs barely 8 inches thick. Saddle-notched corners. Mud chinking mixed with prairie grass. A sod roof. A dirt floor. Total cost, $16. It had seemed adequate in August. It had seemed adequate in September. By late January, with the firewood gone, with the wind finding every gap in the chinking, with frost forming on the inside walls, thick enough to scrape with a fingernail, the cabin had become a coffin waiting to close. He was heading for Elk Bend, the nearest town, 22 miles south. He would not make it. He knew this now with the certainty of a man who has done the arithmetic of survival. His wife Ada could not travel 22 miles. His children could not travel 22 miles. He himself, fighting through waist-deep snow with every step, hauling a sled that caught on buried sagebrush, could not travel 22 miles. The numbers did not work. The distance was too great, the cold too deep, the day too short. He was about to turn back, about to drag his family to the inadequate cabin they had just abandoned, when he saw smoke. A single column of gray rising against the white sky, so thin he almost mistook it for a trick of the blowing snow. But it held steady. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant shelter. Fire meant someone had built something out here that was still standing, still burning, still holding back the cold that was killing everything else on the prairie. Henry Fisk changed direction. He turned toward the smoke. He did not know whose cabin produced it. He did not know if the door would open when he knocked. He only knew that the column of smoke was the only vertical line in a horizontal world of death. The only sign that somewhere on this frozen plain, someone had built something strong enough to survive. That story begins 8 months earlier, in a different season, under a different sky, when a woman walked into a land office, carrying everything she needed to change her life. June 1880. Elk Bend, Dakota Territory, was not much of a town. A single street of packed dirt, running north to south. A general store that doubled as the post office. A blacksmith shop. A small church built from lumber, hauled 90 miles by wagon. A saloon that served warm beer to dusty men. A feed store. A land office, newly established by the federal government to process the flood of homestead claims pouring into Dakota Territory. The railroad had reached Elk Bend the previous year, connecting it to the wider world, by a thin line of iron. That connection had transformed the town from a dot on a surveyor's map into a destination. Settlers arrived weekly, sometimes daily, stepping off trains with their tools, their savings, their families, their ambitions. They filed claims. They built cabins. They broke sod. They planted. They believed. The woman who walked into the land office on the 14th of June did not arrive with a family. She came alone. She carried a leather satchel containing her documents, her savings in cash, her late husband's death certificate. She wore a plain dress, practical boots, a sun hat that had seen better years. Her hands were rough, the hands of someone accustomed to physical work, scarred across the knuckles, calloused on the palms. She was 31 years old. Her name was Willa Crenshaw. The clerk behind the counter, a young man named Patterson, who had processed over 200 homestead applications in the past 6 months, looked up from his ledger. Most applicants were men, families sometimes, single men frequently. A woman alone was unusual enough to make him pause. Willa placed her documents on the counter. The filing fee, the application, the death certificate for Caleb Crenshaw, deceased February 1878, Ashland County, Wisconsin. She wanted to file a homestead claim, 160 acres, as provided under the Homestead Act. She understood the requirements. 5 years of continuous residence, improvement of the land, construction of a dwelling no smaller than 10 feet by 12. She was prepared to meet every condition. Patterson examined the death certificate, glanced at the application, then looked at her again. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as though sharing something confidential. It was rough out there, he told her, especially for a woman on her own. No neighbors close by. Hard winters. Most of the good claims near town were taken. What remained was farther out, 20 miles or more from Elk Bend. Had she considered alternatives? Perhaps a position in town, working at the general store, taking in laundry, something more suitable. Willa's expression did not change. She had heard variations of this speech before. In Wisconsin after Caleb died. In Chicago when she inquired about westbound fares. At every stop along the way where a woman traveling alone invited unsolicited advice. The law doesn't prohibit it, she said. Her voice carried no defensiveness, no pleading, no anger. It was the voice of someone stating a fact as obvious as whether I'd like to file. Patterson processed the application. He had no legal grounds to refuse, only personal doubts he kept to himself as he stamped the papers, collected the fee, recorded the claim in the territorial ledger. Willa Crenshaw, 160 acres, Section 14, Township 112, Range 63, 20 miles northwest of Elk Bend. She signed her name, collected her copy, walked out. Outside the land office, 3 men sat on the porch of the general store across the street. They had watched her go in. Now they watched her come out, a widow filing a homestead claim, on her own, 20 miles from town. The story would reach every cabin within 30 miles by week's end. In a place where news traveled by horseback, gossip traveled faster. Most settlers chose their building site within hours of arriving on their claim. Time mattered. Every day spent deliberating was a day, not spent building, not spent breaking sod, not spent preparing for winter. The standard approach was simple. Find flat ground near water, start cutting logs. Flat ground was easy to build on, easy to plow, come spring. Proximity to water saved hauling distance. Beyond those 2 considerations, the specific location mattered little. One patch of prairie looked much like another. Willa did not choose her site for 3 days. She walked her entire 160 acres, north to south, east to west, cutting across the diagonals, following the contours of the land. She slept under the open sky. Those 3 nights, her bedroll spread on prairie grass, watching the stars wheel overhead. She was not lost. She was not indecisive. She was reading the land, the way her father had taught her to read the forests of northern Maine, the way Caleb had taught her to read timber stands in Wisconsin. Every landscape had a language. Ridgelines told you about wind. Vegetation told you about water. Soil color told you about drainage. The angle of grass told you which direction the prevailing wind blew. You simply had to pay attention. On the 3rd day, she found what she was looking for. A slight depression in the prairie, barely noticeable unless you were standing in it, sheltered on the north side by a low rise of ground, perhaps 8 feet higher than the depression floor. To the west, another gentle rise provided partial protection from that direction. The prevailing wind across the Dakota prairie blew from the northwest. That wind, hitting those rises, would lift over the depression. Not by much, perhaps just enough to matter. In a Dakota winter, just enough to matter could become just enough to survive. She drove her stake. She had found her ground. The nearest homesteader, a man named Samuel Pardee, whose claim adjoined hers to the south, noticed the stake 3 days later when he rode north to check the boundary of his property. He saw the woman camped near the stake, already hauling stones from a creek bed a quarter-mile east. He did not stop to introduce himself. He rode home, told his wife Ruth what he had seen, then mentioned it to 2 other settlers he encountered that week. The widow from the land office had staked her claim in a low spot. Not even flat ground. Some kind of hollow. Strange choice for someone who supposedly knew what she was doing. The stones came first. Hundreds of them, pulled from the creek bed, dug from the rocky soil of her claim, loaded into a makeshift sledge, dragged by hand to the building site. Willa had no horse yet. She would buy one later, after the cabin was finished, with whatever money remained. For now, every stone traveled by human power. Her power. She was not a large woman, 5 feet 6 inches, perhaps 135 pounds. But 3 years in the Wisconsin lumber camps had given her a strength that had nothing to do with size. She had cooked for 40 men, hauled water from frozen streams, helped stack cordwood in temperatures that cracked axe handles. Her body understood work, the way a musician's fingers understood an instrument, automatically, esting, efficiently, without wasted motion. The foundation rose over 2 weeks, a continuous wall of fitted stone, extending 2 feet below ground level, rising 1 foot above the surface. Every other cabin in Dakota Territory sat on 4 cornerstones, maybe 6 if the builder was conscientious. Those cabins rested on points, with open air beneath the floor between those points. Cold air. Air that in winter would creep upward through any gap in a dirt floor, stealing heat from the room above. Willa's cabin would sit on a continuous stone perimeter. No gap. No open air beneath. The cold would have to penetrate stone to reach the floor, not merely flow under it. The extra work cost her 2 weeks. 2 weeks when she could have been cutting logs. 2 weeks that would have been unnecessary in a mild winter. 2 weeks that her neighbors, had they been watching closely, would have called wasteful. They were watching. Not closely, but with the casual attention that frontier people paid to anything unusual happening within riding distance. The widow hauling stones, still hauling stones. Nothing but stones for 2 weeks straight. When does she plan to actually build? The logs came next. Cottonwood mostly, with some elm, cut from the trees along the creek that wound through the eastern portion of her claim. The creek was modest, barely 6 feet wide in most places, but its banks supported enough timber for her purposes. Most settlers cut whatever trees were closest to their building site. Proximity meant efficiency. Time was the enemy. Get the cabin up. Get it roofed. Get a fire going before cold weather. Every hour spent being selective about timber was an hour wasted. Willa walked the creek for 2 miles in each direction before cutting a single tree. She examined each trunk, checking diameter, straightness, the pattern of branching. She wanted logs at least 12 inches across, as uniform in diameter as possible, with minimal branching that would create weak points or uneven surfaces. When she found a suitable tree, she marked it with a blaze cut. When she had marked enough trees to complete her walls, she began felling. Each tree came down with an axe. She had no crosscut saw, no partner to work the other end, just an axe kept sharp with a stone she carried in her apron pocket. The technique was specific: undercut on the falling side, back cut from the opposite side, a controlled drop that laid the trunk where she wanted it. Lumber camp skills. Caleb had taught her the basics. She had refined them through 3 Wisconsin winters, watching the professional loggers, studying their efficiency, adopting their methods. Each felled tree was stripped of bark immediately. Bark held moisture. Moisture invited rot. Rot weakened wood. Bark also provided shelter for insects that would bore into the log, creating channels for water, accelerating decay. A log with its bark removed dried faster, lasted longer, provided better insulation. Every experienced builder knew this. Most Dakota settlers did it anyway, leaving the bark on, because stripping it took time they didn't want to spend. Then each stripped log sat for 2 weeks before Willa dragged it to the building site. This was the detail that would have driven her neighbors to distraction had they understood what she was doing. Letting cut logs sit before using them seemed like pure delay, the kind of excessive patience that marked someone as unsuited for frontier life. But wood shrinks as it dries. A green log, freshly cut, still full of sap, could lose up to 10% of its diameter as it seasoned. A 12-inch green log would become a 10.5-inch seasoned log. That 1.5 inches of shrinkage, multiplied across every course of a wall, multiplied across every log in the structure, created gaps. Gaps between logs that had fit tightly when first laid. Gaps that no amount of chinking could permanently seal, because the wood continued shrinking for months after construction, pulling away from the chinking material, opening new channels for wind. Willa had seen it happen. In the lumber camps, shanties built from green logs developed gaps wide enough to slide a finger through by mid-January. The men stuffed rags into the cracks, piled snow against the walls for insulation, huddled closer to the stove. It worked, mostly. In a normal winter. In a killing winter, those gaps became the difference between discomfort but survival versus something worse. She would not let it happen. 2 weeks of drying would not fully season the logs. That took months or years, but it would start the process. The initial shrinkage, the most dramatic reduction, would occur before construction. The logs would be closer to their final dimensions when she laid them. The gaps would be smaller. The chinking would hold better. It was not perfect, but it was better than building green. By early August, she had 40 logs ready. The construction of the walls began. The first course of logs went down on the stone foundation, heavy 12-inch timbers notched at the corners. Here Willa departed from standard practice in a way that added significant labor but would prove critical in the months ahead. Most settlers used saddle notches at the corners, a simple joint created by cutting a rounded depression in the top of each log, where the perpendicular log sat. Saddle notches were quick to cut, required minimal skill, provided an acceptable connection in moderate conditions. Willa cut dovetail joints. Each corner log was shaped into a flared tenon that locked into a matching mortise in the perpendicular log. The joint was self-tightening, meaning that the weight of the logs above pressed the dovetail tighter into its seat. As the wood dried further, as the inevitable shrinkage occurred, the dovetail geometry compensated, where a saddle notch would loosen, allowing the logs to shift, to separate slightly, to create gaps at the most vulnerable point in the wall. A dovetail joint held firm, tighter actually, as the years passed. The dovetail took 3 times longer to cut than a saddle notch. Each corner required careful measurement, precise axe work, test, fitting, answered, adjustment. 4 corners, 7 courses high, 28 dovetail joints on the inner wall alone, each one cut by hand, fitted by hand, checked by hand. The wall rose, log upon log, chinked between courses with a mixture of clay, sand, fine grass. The inner wall reached 7 feet. Willa stopped. She had built what appeared to be a complete cabin, lacking only a roof. Neighbors passing at a distance might have thought she was nearly finished. Then she did something that confirmed, in the minds of everyone within riding distance, that the widow Crenshaw had lost whatever good judgment she might once have possessed. She began building a second wall, 3 feet outside the first. Another set of 12-inch logs, rising parallel to the inner wall, notched at the corners, with the same painstaking dovetail joints, chinked with the same clay mixture. A wall around a wall, a cabin around a cabin, with a 3-foot gap between them that served no purpose anyone could imagine. The word spread through Elk Bend within days. That widow north of Party's Place was building double walls, as though one set of 12-inch logs was not sufficient, as though the thousands of cabins that functioned perfectly well across Dakota Territory with single walls were somehow inadequate, as though this woman, this outsider, this widow with no farming experience, no cattle, no apparent plan beyond constructing the most overbuilt structure in the territory, knew something that generations of frontier settlers did not, The nickname arrived before the outer wall reached its third course. The Fool's Fort. Samuel Pardee coined it, though he would later deny that, as people often deny the origins of cruelties, that history proves unkind. The Fool's Fort. The phrase captured perfectly what everyone believed, that Willa Crenshaw was building a fortress against an enemy that did not exist, spending money she could not afford, wasting time she did not have, all because she was too frightened of winter to build sensibly. Pardee himself rode over in mid-August to examine the construction firsthand. He was 46 years old, a veteran of the Civil War who had survived Antietam with a musket ball scar on his left shoulder. A man who had built his own cabin in 3 weeks, who had broken 40 acres of sod in his first season, who understood the economics of frontier survival, the way a shopkeeper understands inventory. You spent what was necessary, not $1 more, not an hour more. The frontier rewarded efficiency, punished excess. He circled the structure on horseback, then dismounted, walking between the inner wall, already complete, reaching the outer wall, now rising to its fourth course. He ran his hand along the dovetail joints. He examined the stone foundation. He looked at the 3-foot gap between the walls, empty for now, waiting for something he could not guess. Building a fort or a house? Willa was on the scaffold she had rigged from scrap lumber, fitting a log into position on the outer wall. She did not stop working. She did not look down. A house looks more like you're expecting an army instead of just winter. Winter can be an army. Pardee tucked his thumbs into his belt, a habit from his military years, a gesture of assessment. You know what all this is costing you? Time, money, or both? Both. My cabin was done in 3 weeks. Cost me $18 total. You've been at this 2 months. Spent more than 100, I'd guess. Still not done. Not done yet. First snow might come early this year. You'll be working in cold weather, trying to finish. Then I'll finish in cold weather. He completed another circuit of the structure, slower this time, studying the construction with the practiced eye of a man who had built things, who understood the relationship between effort invested in materials used. He could see the quality. The joints were excellent. The logs were well chosen, uniform, carefully stripped. The foundation was superior to anything else in the territory. None of this was accidental. Whoever this woman was, she knew how to build. But knowing how to build well was not the same as knowing what to build. Skill misdirected was still waste. A perfectly constructed bridge to nowhere was still a bridge to nowhere. He stopped in front of Willa, looking up at her on the scaffold. It's your money, your time. But seems to me if you'd built sensible, you'd have a cabin plus a barn by now. Maybe a hen house. What's the point of a house so expensive you can't afford anything else? Willa set down her axe. She looked at him directly for the first time. Her face was sunburned, lined beyond her years, marked by the kind of weathering that comes from working outdoors in every season. Her eyes held no anger, no defensiveness. Something quieter than both. The point is being alive, come spring to afford other things. Pardee held her gaze for a moment. Then he shook his head, mounted his horse, rode south toward his own claim. By evening, the story had reached 3 more homesteads. By week's end, it had reached Elk Bend, the widow building the fort, wasting her grubstake on a cabin that could survive artillery but wouldn't help her farm a single acre. Too scared of cold to make it out here. She would head back east before Christmas. The frontier sorted people. The strong stayed. The cautious left. Willa Crenshaw, everyone agreed, would leave. The sawdust arrived in mid-August. 12 wagon loads hauled 60 miles from Dutch Brennan's mill. Brennan was a practical man who operated the nearest sawmill to Elk Bend, a noisy operation on the Vermilion River that supplied lumber to half the territory. He had received Willa's order with skepticism. 12 loads of sawdust. Sawdust was a waste product. He burned most of it, used some to pack ice in summer. The idea of hauling it 60 miles across open prairie struck him as eccentric at best. But her money was real. She had paid half up front, cash drawn from savings she had accumulated. Over 3 years of work in the Wisconsin lumber camps. 3 years of cooking for crews, washing clothes in frozen streams, mending tools, doing whatever needed doing for wages that she spent almost nothing of. Every dollar saved against the day she would need it. This was that day. The remaining half she would pay after her first harvest, a standard arrangement backed by a letter of reference from her former employer in Wisconsin, a man named Elias Hargrove, who ran the largest logging operation in Ashland County. Hargrove's letter was brief. Willa Crenshaw is honest, capable, harder working than most of my crew. I vouch for her word. That letter, more than the cash, persuaded Brennan to load his wagons. The sawdust filled the 3-foot gap between the inner wall, already 7 feet high, sealed tight, chinked twice, solid as stone, versus the outer wall, now reaching its full height of 8 feet, the additional foot, creating a ledge that would support the roof structure. Willa packed the sawdust by hand, working from the bottom up, compressing each layer to eliminate air pockets. Air pockets meant convection currents. Convection meant heat transfer. She wanted the sawdust packed so tight that no air could circulate within it. 3 feet of dead, motionless, compressed sawdust between 2 solid log walls. Sawdust was known to be decent insulation. A few frontier families used it in attic spaces, stuffed between rafters to slow heat loss through the roof. But those applications used inches of sawdust, 3 or 4 inches, maybe 6. Willa was using 3 feet, 36 as a crescipestre separating the interior of her cabin from the outside air. The thermal barrier this created was extraordinary, equivalent to a stone wall several feet thick, at a fraction of the weight. She had calculated none of this with mathematical precision. There were no thermal engineering tables available to a homesteader in 1880. What she had was experience. She had felt the difference between a well-insulated structure versus a poorly insulated one. In the lumber camps, the cookhouse where she worked had walls stuffed with sawdust by some previous builder. The bunkhouses did not. On January nights, when the bunkhouses required constant stoking of the stove to remain bearable, the cookhouse stayed warm with a modest fire that Willa banked before bed, still giving off heat when she rose at 4 in the morning. The difference was the sawdust. She had noted it. She had remembered it. She was reproducing it at a scale no one had attempted. The locals learned about the sawdust within days. 12 wagon loads. The entire gap between her double walls, packed floor to ceiling. The reaction was predictable, beyond excessive, wasteful, beyond comprehension. The work of a woman too frightened of cold to think straight. She had spent her savings on sawdust. Sawdust. The woman had invested her future in wood shavings. Reverend Amos Tull arrived on a Tuesday in early September. He was 53, lean, gray-bearded, a Methodist minister who had followed his congregation west from Indiana when the Homestead Rush began. He served as Elk Bend's spiritual leader, its informal counselor, its voice of communal concern. When someone in the settlement was struggling, Tull appeared, not to judge, not to preach, outside of Sundays, simply to offer whatever help the situation required. He rode up to Willa's building site in mid-afternoon, dismounted, tied his horse to the scaffold post. He took his time examining the structure, walking the perimeter, running his hand along the outer wall, peering into the gap where the sawdust was packed. When he finished his inspection, he removed his hat, held it against his chest, a gesture of respect he probably did not realize he was making. Willa climbed down from the roof frame where she had been fitting rafters. She knew why he was here. The same reason people came to see anything unusual on the frontier. Curiosity dressed as concern. Tull spoke gently. He understood she had her reasons. He admired her determination. But he worried about her, out here alone, 20 miles from town, with winter approaching. She had spent most of her savings on the cabin. She had no crop in the ground, no livestock beyond horses she had purchased the previous week, no nearby family. If something went wrong, if she fell ill, if the winter proved harsh, she would be isolated. He was not suggesting she abandon her claim. He was simply offering options. A room could be found in town. Work was available. She could return to her claim in spring, better supplied, better prepared. His concern was genuine. Tull was not a man who performed kindness for social credit. He worried the way a shepherd worries about a sheep that has wandered farther from the flock than seems wise. His worry was real, even if his understanding of the sheep was incomplete. Willa listened without interrupting. When he finished, she thanked him for his concern. She meant it. Kindness was not so common on the frontier that it could be dismissed lightly. But she would not be leaving. She would not be moving to town. She would be staying here, in the cabin she was building, through whatever winter brought. "Reverend, I appreciate your good heart, but I'll be right here." Tull replaced his hat. He nodded. He rode back toward Elk Bend, his worry undiminished. He did not understand why a woman would choose isolation over community, why she would invest everything in walls instead of spreading her resources across the dozen needs a homesteader faced. He would understand later. Everyone would understand later. But in September 1880, the understanding had not yet arrived. Through the final weeks of September, the cabin took its finished shape. The roof went up in layers. First, rough-cut boards laid across heavy rafters twice the thickness of standard construction, necessary to support what was coming above. Then a thick layer of sod, cut from the prairie in heavy rectangles, laid like bricks across the boards. Then a second layer of boards. Then a second layer of sod. Then tar paper over the top, the final barrier against rain, against snowmelt, against the relentless moisture that destroyed roofs across the territory. 4 layers where other cabins had 1, maybe 2. The weight was enormous. Those oversized rafters flexed slightly under the load, but held firm, the engineering sound even if extravagant. The stone floor came next. Thousands of small flat stones, hauled from the creek bed, from the rocky ground of her claim, fitted together across the entire 16 by 20 foot interior. No dirt floor for this cabin. Dirt floors held moisture. Bred insects could not be properly cleaned. Transmitted cold from the frozen ground directly into the living space. Stone could be swept. Stone, properly laid with minimal gaps, provided a barrier between the earth below, plus the room above. The fireplace rose at the north end, a massive structure of mortared stone, the firebox 4 feet wide, the throat angled to draw smoke efficiently, the chimney extending 3 feet above the roof peak to prevent downdrafts. The hearthstone was a single flat boulder, nearly 3 feet across, dragged from the creek bank where it had sat for 10,000 years. It took Willa an entire day to move that stone a quarter mile. She used rollers cut from small logs, levers made from branches, patience measured in inches per hour. A glass window went into the south wall. Small, perhaps 18 inches square, but real glass, purchased in Elk Bend at a cost that made the storekeeper raise his eyebrows. Most homesteaders covered their window openings with greased paper, translucent enough to admit dim light, cheap enough to replace when it tore. Glass was a luxury, but glass sealed tighter than paper. Glass did not deteriorate in moisture. Glass, with properly fitted shutters inside to trap an additional air layer at night, provided both light during the day with insulation after dark. The door was her particular pride. Built from double-thickness planks, fitted with iron hinges, purchased from the blacksmith in Elk Bend. Then a second door, smaller, set 4 feet inside the first, creating an airlock entry. 2 doors with a buffer space between them. Opening the outer door admitted cold air into the buffer. Closing it trapped that cold air. Opening the inner door then admitted only the trapped buffer air, already slightly warmed by proximity to the cabin interior, rather than a direct blast of outside cold. The principle was simple. The execution required 2 doors where everyone else built one. Chinking filled every gap. A mixture of clay, gathered from a deposit near the creek, sand, fine dried grass, worked into a paste, pressed into every crevice between logs on both walls. When the first layer dried, Willa applied a second layer over the top, filling any cracks that had developed as the first layer contracted. 2 layers of chinking on 2 walls. 4 total applications of sealant between the cabin interior with the outside air. October arrived. The cabin was complete, but Willa did not stop working. A small barn rose 20 feet from the cabin. Single-wall construction, which might have seemed hypocritical, given her double-wall cabin, but the barn sheltered a horse, not a human. The horse needed protection from wind, from direct snowfall. It did not need the thermal barrier that human survival required. The barn went up in 6 days, rough but solid. A root cellar took shape next, dug into the hillside north of the cabin, lined with stone, roofed with heavy timbers covered in sod, cool in summer, resistant to freezing in winter. The cellar would store root vegetables, preserved meat, anything that needed protection from temperature extremes. Every day without exception, Willa cut firewood. She rose before dawn, worked on whatever construction task demanded attention, then spent the final hours of daylight felling trees, bucking them into stove lengths, splitting them with an axe, stacking the split wood in rows between the cabin, along with the barn. The rows grew one cord to 5'10". By mid-October, the firewood supply filled every available space, stacked higher than her head, enough fuel to seem absurd for a single occupant of a single cabin. Her neighbors had stopped commenting. The novelty of the fool's fort had worn thin. The jokes had been made, the head-shaking completed. Now they simply felt sorry for her. All that work, all that expense, for a first winter she probably would not finish anyway. The frontier sorted people. The strong endured through practical efficiency. The cautious exhausted themselves with preparation, spent their reserves before the test even began, then had nothing left when the test arrived. Willa Crenshaw, everyone figured, had sorted herself. She would leave by Christmas, maybe sooner. In the evenings, after the work was done, after the fire burned in the massive fireplace, after she had eaten whatever simple meal she prepared from her stored provisions, Willa sat in the cabin she had built, alone. The silence of the prairies surrounded her, vast, indifferent, so complete that her own heartbeat seemed loud. She thought about Caleb. She thought about him most evenings, though the shape of the thoughts had changed over 2 years. In the months immediately after his death, the thoughts had been raw, a wound reopened nightly. His face, his voice, the particular way he laughed, starting silent, then building, the weight of his arm across her shoulders, the ordinary intimacies of a marriage that had lasted 4 years, before ending in a collapse of lumber on a frozen February morning. Now the thoughts were different, not less painful, but more purposeful. She thought about the bunkhouse where he died, the one whose roof had been built good enough, standard construction, log size to specification, rafters calculated for normal snow loads. It had stood for 3 winters without trouble. The 4th winter brought a 3-day blizzard that dumped 6 feet of heavy wet snow onto a roof designed for 4. The weight exceeded the capacity. The center beam cracked at 2 in the morning. The roof fell, 9 men in bunks below. 7 crawled out. 2 did not. Caleb was one of the 2. She remembered his face when they pulled him free. Not twisted in pain, not frozen in terror. Surprised. Just surprised. He had gone to sleep, believing the roof above him was sufficient. He had died beneath the proof that it was not. The expression on his face, when they uncovered him, was the expression of a man who had been wrong about something important, but never got the chance to learn from the mistake. That expression haunted Willa. Not as a ghost, but as a lesson. The thing you build must be stronger than the worst thing that can happen to it. Not stronger than the worst thing that has happened. Stronger than the worst thing that could happen. Those were different categories. The worst that had happened was known, documented, survived by the structures that remained standing. The worst that could happen was unknown, undocumented, survivable only by structures built with imagination rather than precedent. She had grown up in northern Maine, in a small settlement where winter meant something the Dakota settlers had not yet learned. Cold in Maine was not the manageable cold of recent Dakota winters. The cold that started in November, relented by March, allowed cattle to graze between storms. Cold in Maine was absolute. Months where the temperature never climbed above freezing. Snow measured in feet per storm, accumulating to depths that buried fences, blocked roads, isolated communities for weeks at a time. She had seen what happened to families whose houses were not built for that cold. She had attended funerals that were delayed until spring because the ground was too frozen to dig graves. She carried those memories the way some people carried scars, invisibly, permanently, shaping every decision, even when the specific memory was not consciously present. When she chose her building site in the Depression, sheltered from the northwest wind, she was not thinking about her childhood in Maine. She was simply choosing correctly, guided by knowledge so deeply absorbed that it functioned as instinct. But tonight, sitting by the fire in her double-walled, sawdust-insulated, stone-floored, glass-windowed, airlock-doored cabin, she allowed herself a question she normally suppressed. Was she building for survival or building for grief? Was the 3-foot wall of sawdust a rational response to the possibility of extreme cold? Or was it a monument to her failure to save Caleb? If she built strong enough, thick enough, solid enough, could she retroactively prevent a death that had already occurred? Could she build her way out of the guilt she carried for not insisting that the bunkhouse roof be reinforced, for not speaking up, for not pushing harder when Caleb had said, "It's fine, Willa, it'll hold"? She did not have an answer. She suspected the truth contained both possibilities. She was building for survival. She was building from grief. The two motivations produced the same result, a cabin that was stronger than anything else on the prairie. Whether the strength came from wisdom or from pain mattered less than the fact that it existed. She banked the fire. She closed the inner shutters over the glass window. She checked the double doors, outer latched, inner latched. She lay down on the bed she had built against the south wall, pulled the quilts over her shoulders, listened to the wind outside. The wind was constant on the prairie, a presence so persistent that silence, true silence, the kind you could find in a Maine forest on a windless January night, did not exist here. The wind was always talking. Tonight it spoke quietly, a low murmur across the grass. Tomorrow she would cut more firewood. There was always more firewood to cut. October 14th, 1880. Willa stepped outside at first light, as she did every morning, to check the sky, to feel the air, to read whatever the day was telling her, before she planned her work. This morning, something was different. The cold was wrong. Not the temperature itself, though it was lower than mid-October should produce. The quality of the cold. It had an edge to it, a sharpness that went beyond the seasonal chill she had felt on previous mornings. The air felt compressed, heavy, as though the atmosphere itself was bracing for something. The sky was wrong. Low clouds, gray, with a yellowish undertone, she recognized from her childhood in Maine. The clouds before the worst storms carried that color, a bruised quality, as though the sky had already been beaten by whatever was coming from behind it. The wind was wrong. It had shifted during the night. For weeks it had blown from the southwest, mild, carrying the last warmth of autumn across the grass. Sometime before dawn it had swung to the northwest, the direction of winter, the direction of cold, the direction from which, in Maine, the killing storms had always arrived. Her horse, penned in the small barn, was restless, stamping, tossing its head. Animals knew things about weather that humans had to learn through observation. Whatever the horse sensed, it did not like. Willa stood motionless for a long time. The prairie stretched away from her in every direction, brown grass bending under the shifted wind, the sky pressing down like a lid being lowered onto a pot. 20 miles to the south, Elk Bend was waking up. People were opening stores, feeding livestock, going about the business of an ordinary October morning. They had no reason to believe this day would be different from any other. Willa had a reason. She had seen this sky before. She had felt this wind before. She had watched animals react this way before. In Maine, before the worst winter storms her memory contained. The ones that buried houses to their rooflines. The ones that killed livestock standing in fields. The ones that tested every wall, every roof, every fireplace. Every decision made during the warm months, when building had seemed like an exercise in optimism rather than a matter of survival. She turned back toward the cabin. She pulled the barn door open, checked the horse's water, added extra feed. She carried 4 additional armloads of split wood from the outdoor stack into the cabin, filling the indoor wood box to overflowing. She drew extra water from the well she had dug 30 feet from the cabin door, filling every container she owned. She checked her food stores in the root cellar, inventorying the dried meat, the flour, the beans, the preserved vegetables. She closed the cellar door, weighted it with a stone. Then she entered the cabin. She closed the outer door, latched it, stepped through the buffer space, closed the inner door, latched it, checked the fire in the fireplace, added 2 heavy logs, closed the inner shutters over the glass window. Then she sat down beside the fire, folded her hands in her lap, looked at the solid walls she had spent 4 months building, the walls everyone called excessive, the walls everyone said were wasted effort, the walls that had earned her the name she knew they used behind her back. The Fool's Fort. She sat, watching the fire. Outside, the wind began to rise. The storm arrived on October 15th, with the patience of something that had traveled 1,000 miles to kill. It did not announce itself with thunder. It did not build gradually, giving settlers time to secure livestock, to haul extra wood inside, to stuff rags into the gaps in their chinking. It simply appeared, as though a curtain had been pulled across the sky, replacing autumn with something older, something predatory, something that had no interest in mercy. By noon, snow fell so thick that visibility collapsed to arm's length. By 2 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 30 degrees. By evening, the thermometer nailed to the post outside Ridley's General Store in Elk Bend, the only reliable instrument within 20 miles, read 20 degrees below zero. The wind came from the northwest at 40 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontal, turning each flake into a tiny projectile that stung exposed skin like a wasp. The combination of wind with cold produced a killing effect that no single element could achieve alone. The wind stripped heat from any surface it touched. The cold froze whatever the wind exposed. Together, they turned the open prairie into a landscape that could kill a healthy man in under an hour. Inside Willa's cabin, the storm registered as sound. A deep, continuous roar, lower than wind usually produced, more felt than heard, vibrating through the stone foundation into the floor, through the floor into the soles of her boots. The outer wall took the full force. 12-inch logs, chinked twice, backed by 3 feet of compressed sawdust, backed by another 12-inch wall, chinked twice more. The wind hit that barrier with everything it carried: snow, ice crystals, the raw kinetic energy of air moving at 40 miles an hour across 1,000 miles of unobstructed prairie, then stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The interior wall did not vibrate. The chinking did not whistle. No draft crept across the stone floor. The air inside the cabin remained still, heated by the fire, burning steadily in the massive stone fireplace, circulating gently in the way that warm air moves when nothing disturbs it. Willa added a log to the fire every 2 hours, not because the cabin required it, but because maintaining a consistent burn was more efficient than letting the fire die down, then rebuilding it. The stone hearth absorbed heat during the burn cycle, radiated it back into the room between feedings. The system worked the way she had designed it to work, the way she had seen it work in the cookhouse at the lumber camp in Wisconsin, where a well-built fireplace in a well-insulated room created warmth that sustained itself with modest fuel input. She ate, she slept. She woke, checked the fire, added wood, slept again. The storm continued for 3 days, 72 hours of unbroken wind, unbroken snow, unbroken cold. She did not open the outer door during that time. She had no reason to. Everything she needed was inside the walls she had spent 4 months building. On the morning of October 18th, the sound changed. The roar diminished, not to silence, but to something closer to the normal voice of prairie wind. Willa opened the inner door, stepped into the airlock buffer, opened the outer door. The world had transformed. Snow covered everything, not the dusting or moderate accumulation that mid-October might reasonably produce, but a burial, 3 feet of snow on level ground, 15-foot drifts where the wind had sculpted the powder against any vertical surface. The landscape she had come to know over 4 months, the gentle rises, the creek bed, the scattered trees, the horizon line where prairie met sky, all of it had vanished beneath white. Even the direction of the sun was uncertain, filtered through clouds so thick that light arrived without shadow, creating a flat, dimensionless illumination that made distance impossible to judge. Her barn was half buried. The door faced south, away from the prevailing wind, a deliberate choice that now proved its value. She could dig to it without fighting the deepest drifts. Her firewood stacks, sheltered partially by the cabin itself, rose from the snow like dark islands. The top courses were accessible. The lower courses were buried but recoverable with effort. She dug a path to the barn. The horse was alive, hungry, anxious, but unharmed. She fed it, broke the ice in its water trough, cleared snow from the doorway. Then she climbed the low rise north of her cabin to see what the storm had done to the wider prairie. The view stopped her breath, not from cold, though the air bit savagely at her exposed face. From the emptiness, nothing moved. No smoke rose from any point on the horizon. No dark shape of a cabin or barn broke the white expanse. The prairie looked as it must have looked before humans arrived. unmarked, indifferent, vast beyond the ability of the eye to process. Somewhere to the south, Samuel Party's cabin stood on his claim. Somewhere beyond that, other homesteads dotted the territory. Somewhere 22 miles distant, Elk Bend huddled around its single street. None of it was visible. The snow had swallowed everything, except her cabin. Her cabin stood. Smoke curled from the chimney. The stone flew, drawing perfectly even in the wind. The structure showed no damage. The walls held. The roof held. The door opened when she wanted it to open, closed when she wanted it to close. The cabin performed exactly as designed. 4 months of labor, more than $100 in materials cease, the mockery of every neighbor within riding distance. All of it justified by 72 hours. That proved the difference between adequate construction versus something better. She did not feel vindicated. She felt relieved. Vindication required an audience, required the people who doubted her to witness the proof. Relief was private, internal. The quiet exhale of a woman who had gambled everything on her own judgment, then watched that judgment hold against the first real test. But she understood something the relief could not mask. This was October. Winter had not yet officially begun. If October could produce a storm like this, what would January bring? What would February deliver? She had built for the worst she could imagine. Standing on that rise, looking at a prairie erased by snow, she wondered whether her imagination had been sufficient. 4 miles to the south, the storm had told a different story inside Samuel Party's cabin. His structure, built to the same specifications as every other homestead in the territory, had survived. Barely. The single thickness walls, 8-inch logs chinked with mud, had transmitted the cold inward with ruthless efficiency. By the second hour of the storm, frost had formed on the inside surface of every wall. By the 6th hour, that frost was thick enough to scrape off with a knife blade. The chinking, adequate in moderate weather, had failed in multiple spots where the wind found gaps too small to see, but large enough to admit razor thin streams of frozen air. Each stream was minor. Together, they created a constant infiltration of cold that the fireplace could not overcome. Samuel had burned everything within reach. The firewood he had cut, a reasonable supply by the standards of previous winters, diminished at 3 times the rate he had anticipated. By the second day he was burning furniture. A chair he had built the previous month, a shelf, the frame of a storage box. Ruth knelt by the fireplace, feeding scraps of wood into a fire that seemed to produce heat only in a narrow radius. Warmth that dissipated into the walls as fast as the flames generated it. They survived. When Samuel dug out his door on the 19th, he stood in the snow, breathing the sharp morning air, feeling the cold attack his face. He was alive. Ruth was alive. The cabin was standing, damaged in its chinking, depleted of fuel, but standing. He had made it through. Then he looked north, toward the claim he had visited in August, toward the structure he had mocked. Through the clear post-storm air, he could see it. The dark shape of Willa Crenshaw's cabin, sitting solid in its depression, smoke rising from the chimney in a straight, undisturbed column. No damage visible, even at this distance. No sign of struggle. Just a cabin doing what a captain was supposed to do, sheltering its occupant from the worst the sky could deliver. Samuel stared at that smoke for a long time. He thought about the 3 days just past, the cold that had penetrated his walls despite the fire, the frost on the interior logs, the wind that had found every failure in his chinking, every shortcut in his construction, every economy he had made in the name of efficiency. He thought about the moments. There had been several when he had looked at Ruth's face in the firelight, seeing fear there that matched his own, when he had genuinely wondered whether they would survive until the storm broke. Then he thought about Willa in that cabin with its double walls, its 3 feet of sawdust, its stone foundation, its massive fireplace. He thought about the warmth that must exist inside those walls. Real warmth. The kind of warmth his cabin had not contained since September. Something shifted in him. Not a dramatic revelation. Not a sudden conversion from skeptic to believer. Something quieter. A crack in the certainty he had carried since August. The certainty that his way was right, that efficiency was wisdom, that the woman building the fort was a fool, spending money she couldn't afford on protection she didn't need. The crack was small. He could still ignore it. he chose to ignore it for now, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging something about his own cabin, his own choices, his own wife shivering by a fire that couldn't keep her warm. He went inside. He began repairing his chicken. He did not ride north to check on Willa. The blizzard of October 15th was not an anomaly, it was an announcement. The opening statement of a winter that would rewrite everything the settlers of Dakota, their territory, believed about cold, about snow, about the limits of endurance. October delivered 2 more blizzards after the first. November brought 4. December brought 5. The temperatures established a new baseline, one that made the previous decade of mild winters seem like a cruel joke. 0 degrees became warm. 10 below became ordinary. 20 below became frequent. 30 below arrived in late November, settled in like a tenant with no intention of leaving. The snow accumulated in layers, each storm adding to what the previous storm had deposited, because the temperatures between storms never rose high enough to melt what had already fallen. By late November, 3 feet of packed snow covered the prairie floor. By mid-December, that number had doubled. Drifts created by the constant wind reached heights that buried fence posts, then buried the tops of the fence posts, then erased any evidence that fence posts had ever existed. Livestock died first. Cattle left in open range, the standard practice in previous winters, when animals could paw through moderate snow to reach grass beneath, found themselves standing on a frozen surface with no way to reach food. Ranchers who had not built shelters, most of them watched their herds diminish daily. Animals froze standing upright, their legs locked, their bodies preserved by the cold in grotesque statues that would dot the prairie until spring. Others starved, growing thinner each week, until they simply lay down in the snow, too weak to stand again. Estimates would later suggest that hundreds of thousands of cattle perished across the northern plains during that winter. The economic devastation would take years to calculate. The railroad failed next. The last train reached Elk Bend on December 14th. It arrived 4 hours late, the locomotive fighting through drifts that the crew cleared by hand, shoveling from the cowcatcher, while the engineer inched forward at walking speed. The supplies it carried, flour, sugar, coffee, kerosene, mail, the small necessities that connected frontier towns to civilization, were unloaded quickly. The train departed south, fighting through the same drifts, barely making it to the next station. The next scheduled train, December 20th, did not arrive. The tracks between Elk Bend, with the junction 40 miles south, had disappeared beneath snow, not covered lightly, not dusted over, but buried. In some cuts where the railroad passed through low ground, the rails lay under 20 feet of compacted snow. The railroad dispatched clearing crews. Men with shovels attacked the drifts, digging trenches through the white mass, exposing the rails inch by inch. They cleared a mile in 3 days. Then a storm hit, refilling the trench in 6 hours. They started again, cleared another mile. Another storm erased their work overnight. The railroad sent a locomotive to punch through. A heavy engine, running at full steam, charged the drifts at speed, its cowcatcher designed to throw snow aside, the way a ship's prow parts water. It made it 12 miles before the snow defeated it, packing so tight around the wheels that the engine could not move forward or backward. A second locomotive, dispatched to rescue the first, reached it after 8 miles of its own battle, then got stuck itself. Both engines sat in the snow, abandoned, their boilers cooling, their crews walking back to the junction on foot, through waist-deep powder. They would remain where they sat until April. No trains meant no supplies. The stores in Elk Bend, stocked for a normal winter where trains ran weekly, began to empty. Flour sold out first in early January. Families who had not stored enough, which was most families, because why store heavily when the train came every week, found themselves grinding raw wheat in coffee mills, producing a coarse meal that could be baked into something resembling bread if you didn't examine it too closely. Coffee disappeared by mid-January. Sugar followed. Kerosene for lamps ran out, plunging homes into darkness once the sun set at 4:30 in the afternoon. Candles became currency. A single tallow candle, worth pennies in normal times, traded for a pound of wheat. Hay replaced firewood for families who had burned through their wood supplies. Prairie grass, cut the previous summer, twisted into tight bundles called cats, burned hot but fast, requiring constant feeding, filling rooms with smoke, providing heat measured in minutes rather than hours. Families sat in smoky darkness, grinding wheat, twisting hay, waiting for a train that did not come, surviving in increments so small that each day's accomplishment was simply reaching the next day. The isolation was perhaps worse than the cold. The previous winter, settlers had visited neighbors, ridden to town for supplies, attended church on Sundays, maintained the social connections that made frontier life bearable. This winter, travel became impossible. The snow was too deep for horses. Roads did not exist, buried under drifts that hid every landmark. A man who left his cabin risked disorientation within 100 yards, the featureless white landscape offering no reference points, no way to determine direction when clouds hid the sun. Settlers who tried to reach neighbors sometimes wandered for hours, sometimes found their way back, sometimes did not. The bodies of those who did not would emerge from the melting snow in April, frozen in postures of walking, still heading in whatever direction they had last chosen. Into this world of white death, the story of Willa Crenshaw's cabin began to travel. Not quickly. Communication between homesteads had slowed to almost nothing, but information like cold found its way through gaps. The boy arrived first, a 14-year-old named Jesse Pruitt, son of a settler whose claim lay 3 miles to the east. The boy had gone out to search for a cow that had broken through a fence during the second October blizzard. He found the cow, frozen solid in a shallow ravine. He did not find his way home. The storm disoriented him. He walked for hours, the snow deepening as the temperature plunged, his coat inadequate, his boots filling with powder that melted against his skin, then refroze. By the time he saw the smoke from Willa's chimney, he could no longer feel his feet. His fingers had stopped bending. His thinking had slowed to a crawl, each thought arriving late, incomplete, as though his mind was freezing along with his body. He knocked on the outer door with his forearm, because his hands would not form fists. Willa opened it within seconds. She pulled the boy inside, through the airlock, into the warmth of the main room. She sat him by the fire. She removed his boots, his socks, examined his feet. Cold white in patches, but not yet the waxy hardness of deep frostbite. She wrapped his feet in dry cloth, positioned them near the hearth, but not too close, warming them gradually rather than rapidly, because rapid warming of frozen tissue destroyed cells. She had seen lumber camp workers lose toes to well-meaning friends who thrust frozen feet against a hot stove. She knew better. She fed the boy, hot broth first, then bread. She wrapped him in quilts. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke, his feet ached with the fierce pain of tissue reviving, a good sign. Willa kept him for 2 days, until the weather cleared enough for her to walk him home. His parents had been frantic, convinced their son was dead. When Willa delivered him to their door, his mother wept. His father tried to speak, but could not manage words. Willa told them where her cabin was, how to find it if they needed shelter. Then she walked home. She told no one about the boy. She had no one to tell, but the Pruitts told their nearest neighbor, who told another. The widow's cabin, built like nothing else in the territory, warm inside. She took in the boy, kept him safe, warmed him back from the edge. The story moved slowly through the frozen landscape, passed between settlers during the rare encounters the weather permitted, carried like a small flame from one isolated homestead to the next. Then the Fisk family arrived, at the end of January, exactly as the flash of smoke had promised from the story's opening breath. Henry Fisk had held out as long as a man could hold out. He had rationed his firewood, burning less each week, allowing his cabin to grow colder in stages, each stage a new definition of bearable. He had stuffed every gap in his chinking with rags, with grass, with strips of cloth, torn from clothing they could no longer afford to wear because layers against the body mattered more than fashion. He had moved his family's beds next to the fireplace, all 4 of them sleeping within arm's reach of the only heat source, their breath-forming clouds even in the firelight. When the wood ran out entirely on January 26th, the decision made itself. They could not stay. Ada's cough had deepened over 3 weeks, from a chest, cold into something that rattled when she breathed, a wet, heavy sound that Willa would later recognize as the signature of pneumonia. The children, 2 girls aged 6 plus 8, a boy of 4, had stopped complaining about the cold. That silence frightened Henry more than any crying. Children who complain are children with energy. Children who go quiet are children who are giving up. He loaded the sled before dawn. Every blanket, every piece of clothing. Ada, wrapped so heavily she could barely move, laid across the sled's rough planks. The 3 children packed around her, tucked into gaps between bundles of fabric, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. Henry tied a rope from the sled to his waist, leaned into the snow, began walking south toward Elk Bend. The journey became its own form of dying. The snow, waist-deep on level ground, chest-deep in the drifts, resisted every step. The sled caught on buried objects, roots, rocks, the frozen corpses of prairie dogs in their collapsed burrows. Each catch required Henry to stop, dig, free the runner, start again. His legs burned. His lungs burned. The cold attacked every inch of exposed skin, finding gaps between his collar, along with his hat, between his gloves at his cuffs, between his scarf plus his face. He could feel himself slowing, his body consuming its reserves, the warmth at his core diminishing degree by degree, as the effort drained him faster than his metabolism could replenish. 4 hours in, with Elk Bend still 18 miles distant, with Ada's breathing growing shallower on the sled behind him, with the children bundled into stillness beneath their blankets, Henry stopped. He stood in the snow, the rope taut against his waist, his legs trembling, his vision narrowing to a tunnel. The arithmetic was final. He could not reach Elk Bend. He could not go back, because back meant an empty cabin with no fuel. He could not stay, because staying meant freezing in place, becoming another of the prairie's frozen statues discovered in spring. He looked up. Northwest against the gray sky, a thin column rose. Smoke, barely visible, easily mistaken for a wisp of blowing snow, but vertical where everything else was horizontal. Vertical meant fire. Fire meant survival. He did not calculate the distance. He did not assess his chances. He simply turned the sled toward the smoke, leaned into the rope, took the next step. The distance to Willa's cabin was approximately 1 mile from where he stood. That mile took him 90 minutes. When he reached the outer door, he could not knock. His arms had stopped obeying commands. He fell against the door instead, his weight producing a thump that carried through both layers of wall into the cabin interior. Willa opened both doors. She saw a man collapsed in the snow, a rope trailing from his waist to a sled, a woman on the sled who appeared more dead than alive, 3 small shapes bundled beneath blankets. She did not hesitate. She grabbed Henry under the arms, dragged him through the airlock into the warmth. Then she went back for Ada, lifting the woman with a strength that came from somewhere beyond muscle, carrying her through the doors, laying her on the bed. Then the children, one by one, each small body stiff with cold but alive, heartbeats detectable, breathing shallow but present. The cabin received them the way it had been built to receive them, though Willa had not known it would serve this purpose when she laid the first stone of the foundation 5 months earlier. The warmth inside was not the desperate localized heat of a single-wall cabin, fighting a losing battle against infiltrating cold. It was ambient. It was everywhere. It filled the room from floor to ceiling, from wall to wall, maintained by the massive stone fireplace, radiating into air that the double walls kept trapped, that the sawdust insulation refused to surrender to the killing temperatures outside. The difference between the cold the Fisk family had been surviving in for weeks, the cold of their inadequate cabin, the cold of the open prairie, versus the warmth of this room was so extreme that it registered almost as pain, the shock of the body encountering conditions it had forgotten were possible. Ada went onto Willa's bed, buried under every blanket in the cabin. Her breathing was audible across the room, a wet crackling that spoke of fluid in the lungs, of infection that the cold had nurtured into something dangerous. Willa propped her upright against rolled quilts, because fluid in the lungs drained better when the body was elevated. She heated water, soaked cloths, laid them across Ada's chest. She brewed tea from dried herbs she had stored in the root cellar, a remedy she had learned from the wife of a lumber camp foreman in Wisconsin. Nothing medicinal in any scientific sense, but warm liquid with mild soothing properties that could ease a cough enough to let damaged lungs begin to heal. The children she placed by the fire. She unwrapped them carefully, checking each child's hands, feet, face. Cold. Reddened. But no waxy patches. No blackened tissue. No sign of the deep frostbite that cost fingers, toes, noses. Henry had wrapped them well, sacrificing his own layers to protect theirs. The quilts he had denied himself had saved his children from permanent damage. Willa covered them with dry blankets, warm from hanging near the fire. She heated broth, spooned it into small mouths that at first refused, then accepted, then wanted more. The 4-year-old boy looked up at her with eyes that were coming back to life, the dullness of cold retreating before the advancing warmth. "Where are we?" His voice was small, rusty from disuse. "You're safe." That word, spoken in a warm room with a fire burning, with the wind locked outside by double walls, was the most important word Willa had ever said. Henry Fisk sat on the stone floor, his back against the wall, his frozen clothes steaming in the heat. He could feel sensation returning to his extremities, a process that involved considerable pain, pins driving into his fingers, knives twisting in his toes. He welcomed the pain. Pain meant living tissue. Pain meant survival. He looked around the cabin. He noted the thickness of the walls, the quality of the chinking, the massive fireplace, the stone floor, the glass window with its closed shutters. He noted the temperature, which bore no resemblance to the temperature inside his own cabin, where fire fought cold to a draw on good days, where cold won decisively on bad ones. Here, cold was not winning. Cold was not even present. Cold existed somewhere outside these walls, pounding to get in, completely denied entry. His chest tightened as the words came out slowly, weighted with exhaustion. "How is it so warm in here?" Willa was tending the fire, adjusting a pot of broth over the coals. She explained briefly. Double walls, sawdust insulation between them, stone foundation sealed underneath. She spoke the way she always spoke about her cabin, factually, without pride, without emphasis, the way someone describes a tool that performs its function. Henry absorbed this in silence. Then, with the bluntness of a man too tired for tact, "Everyone calls you the fool. I know. They were wrong." The words were not an apology on behalf of others. They were a correction, a factual amendment to a consensus that the last 4 hours had overturned. 3 days passed inside those walls. Ada's fever broke on the second night, her cough loosening, her breathing clearing as the warm air, the rest, the fluids did their work. The children recovered with the speed that only children possess, their small bodies bouncing back from cold that would have damaged adults permanently. By the second day, they were exploring the cabin, touching the stone walls, examining the fireplace, asking questions with the relentless curiosity of kids in a new place. The 4-year-old discovered that the stone floor was warm near the hearth, cool near the walls. He spent an hour mapping the temperature gradient with his bare feet, treating it as a game. His laughter, a cabin that had known only the sounds of a single occupant for 5 months. Willa watched the children with an expression she kept carefully neutral. She had not built this cabin for children's laughter. She had built it for survival, for silence, for the solitary endurance of a woman who had lost her husband to inadequate construction, who had poured that loss into walls, thick enough to hold back whatever came. The laughter was unexpected. Not unwelcome, but unexpected, like finding wildflowers growing in a place you had cleared for a different purpose. On the third morning, Ada was strong enough to sit up, to eat solid food, to speak in more than fragments. Henry made his decision. They would not return to their cabin. The structure was useless, a shell of thin logs with no fuel, no insulation, no capacity to sustain life through the months of winter still ahead. He would take his family to Elk Bend, stay with his wife's cousin, who had a house in town. The claim could wait. Survival mattered more than ownership. Before loading his family back onto the sled for the much shorter journey to town, Henry stood with Willa by the cabin door. "How much firewood do you have left?" Willa's mouth formed something that was not quite a smile. "Enough." The word carried more confidence than she felt. The 3 days of sheltering 5 additional people had consumed wood at a rate she had not planned for. Her calculations, precise when they accounted for a single occupant, maintaining a single fire, had not included the possibility of becoming a refuge. Each additional body in the cabin was an additional life, sustained by her fuel supply. Each life sustained was a subtraction from the total she had stockpiled. The arithmetic still worked for now, but the margin had narrowed. Henry left with his family. He headed south toward Elk Bend, the distance shorter, the route more direct than his original attempt. Ada rode the sled, wrapped warmly, her color better, her breathing clearer. The children sat around her, bundled but animated. The horror of the journey 3 days prior, already fading into the resilience of youth. Henry leaned into the rope, with legs that had rested, with a body that had been fed, with the knowledge that he was pulling toward shelter, rather than away from death. Before disappearing into the white distance, Henry called back through the cold air that he would send anyone who needed help, that he would tell people, that the cabin existed, that it was warm, that the woman there would take you in. He kept that promise. Within 2 weeks, the first consequence arrived. A family of 4 from a claim 8 miles northeast, their own cabin failing, their firewood exhausted, guided toward Willa's smoke by directions Henry had given to someone who had told someone else. Then a single man, a drifter caught between settlements when a blizzard struck, who had wandered the prairie for 6 hours. Before the column of smoke appeared against the gray sky like a signal from a civilization he had begun to doubt still existed. Then another family, then 2 brothers who had shared a claim to the west. The cabin absorbed them all. It was not designed as a shelter for 12 people. It was designed for 1. But the principles that made it livable for 1 made it survivable for 12. The double walls did not care how many people huddled behind them. The sawdust insulation did not thin because additional bodies warmed the air. The stone fireplace radiated heat into a room that contained 12 people as readily as it radiated heat into a room containing 1. The space was tight. The air grew close. Privacy ceased to exist, but warmth persisted. In a winter that was killing people through cold, warmth was the only currency that mattered. Willa managed the household with the quiet efficiency she had learned in the lumber camps. Cooking for 12 was something she had done for years. She organized sleeping rotations since the cabin could not accommodate 12 people lying down simultaneously. She rationed food from her root cellar, calculating consumption against remaining stores, stretching meals with broth, with coarse bread, with the dried beans that became the staple of every dinner. She assigned tasks: wood hauling, water fetching, fire tending, distributing the labor of survival among people who might otherwise have sat idle, staring at the walls, waiting for winter to end or for hope to expire. At night when the others slept, Willa sat by the fire conducting a different kind of inventory. Not food, though food concerned her. Not water, though the well had begun producing sluggishly as the ground froze deeper. Firewood. The towers of split cottonwood that had seemed inexhaustible in October had diminished visibly. She had cut enough for 1 person through 1 winter, even a harsh one. She was now burning for 12 people through the harshest winter in memory. The math was relentless. Each cord that disappeared was a cord she could not replace, because the snow was too deep to reach the trees along the creek, because the effort of cutting wood in 30 below temperatures consumed almost as many calories as the wood produced in heat, because the saw that would have made cutting efficient was a tool she did not own, having relied on her axe for everything. She calculated. If winter ended in March, the standard expectation, she had enough. Tight, but enough. If winter extended into April, which this winter seemed inclined to do, the supply fell short. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but the trajectory pointed toward a gap, a period in late March or early April when the firewood would run out while the cold persisted. For the first time since she had broken ground on the foundation the previous June, Willa felt fear that was not about the past. Every decision she had made until now had been driven by the memory of Caleb, by the knowledge of what inadequate construction could cost. That fear looked backward. This fear looked forward. She had built something strong enough to shelter 12 lives. Now she faced the possibility that she had not stored enough fuel to sustain what her walls protected. She thought about Caleb's face, the surprise frozen onto it. He had believed enough was enough. She had built her entire philosophy around the rejection of enough. Yet here she sat, surrounded by people who trusted her cabin the way Caleb had trusted his bunkhouse roof, facing the possibility that her own version of enough might prove insufficient. I built the walls for the worst I could imagine, she murmured to herself, so quietly that no sleeping person stirred. I forgot to stack the wood for it, too. February delivered the winter's cruelest stretch. 3 blizzards in 11 days, with temperatures that touched 40 below between storms. The snow, already deep beyond precedent, deepened further. The wind, tireless, reshaped the drifts nightly, erasing paths that had been dug during the day, reburying structures that had been partially excavated. The world outside Willa's cabin became a hostile abstraction, a white emptiness that existed primarily as a threat, as the source of the cold that her walls held at bay, as the reason 12 people shared a space built for one. During the second February blizzard, Willa's horse died. The barn, single-walled, had provided adequate shelter through the fall storms, through January. But the sustained cold of February, combined with diminishing feed, weakened the animal past recovery. Willa found it lying on the barn floor. One morning, still warm, its breathing stopped sometime during the night. She stood over it for a full minute, allowing herself to feel the loss before compartmentalizing it into the practical question it immediately became. The horse was dead. The barn still held firewood value. The boards, the beams, the rafters, all burnable. Not yet, but the option existed if the woodpile dwindled past the point of safety. She closed the barn door. She did not mention the horse to anyone in the cabin. They had enough fears without adding hers. March arrived without mercy. The calendar said spring. The thermometer disagreed. Temperatures remained below zero. Snow continued falling. The railroad remained buried. Elk Bend had long since exhausted its stores. Families in town survived on the charity of those slightly less desperate, on wheat ground by hand, on the stubborn refusal to die that constitutes the final reserve of people who have no other reserves remaining. In the third week of March, Samuel Pardee appeared at Willa's door. He did not knock. He stood outside, in the trampled path between the outer door, with the snow wall that sheltered it, stood there for several minutes before Willa noticed him through the small glass window. She opened the door. The man she saw bore little resemblance to the confident horseman who had circled her construction site 7 months earlier. Pardee had lost weight, perhaps 30 pounds. His face was gaunt, shadowed, aged beyond the months that had passed. His clothes hung loosely. His eyes held something she recognized, because she had seen it in her own mirror after Caleb died, the particular emptiness of someone who has lost the person they most needed to keep. Ruth was dead. He told her this without preamble, standing in the airlock between the 2 doors, the cold still clinging to his coat. Pneumonia. The same pneumonia that had threatened Ada Fisk, but that Ada had survived because Ada had reached a warm cabin where her body could fight the infection. Instead of fighting the cold simultaneously, Ruth had fought both. The cold won. She died in their cabin on a night when the temperature inside, despite the fire, despite Samuel's desperate feeding of every burnable object he could find, never rose above freezing. She died under every blanket they owned, her husband holding her, his body heat not enough, nothing enough. He had buried her in a snowdrift outside the cabin. The ground was frozen too deep to dig. He had covered her with snow, then with stones to keep animals away, then with more snow, a temporary resting place. He would bury her properly in spring, when the ground thawed, when the earth accepted the dead again instead of rejecting them with frozen indifference. He had not come to Willa's cabin seeking shelter. His own cabin still stood, marginally habitable, now that he was alone, now that the fuel requirements served only one body. He had come because he needed to stand inside these walls. He needed to feel the warmth. He needed to understand what he had mocked, what he had dismissed, what had been available. 20 minutes ride from his cabin, while his wife died of cold. The people sheltering in the cabin gave Pardee space. They recognized the look on his face. Several of them had lost neighbors, friends, livestock. One had lost a brother, whose claim lay 30 miles north, news that had arrived through the slow chain of communication that winter could not entirely sever. Loss was common enough that its markers were immediately recognizable. The hollow gaze, the movements made on autopilot, the voice that functioned but carried nothing behind the words. Pardee stood by the fireplace. He held his hands toward the heat. The warmth soaked into fingers that had been cold for 5 months, into joints that ached from the sustained assault of a winter that did not relent. He looked at the walls, the logs, the chinking that showed no gaps, the inner surface free of frost. He looked at the ceiling, the heavy rafters supporting the multi-layered roof. He looked at the stone floor, warm near the hearth, cool at the edges, but nowhere cold, nowhere frozen, nowhere hostile. He looked at Willa. "I called you a fool." His voice scraped against something raw, something underneath the words that had nothing to do with construction methods or building. "In philosophy, I remember. I was wrong. You had good reason to think what you thought. Most winters, this cabin would be wasteful. This isn't most winters." A silence opened between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire, the shifting of sleeping people, the muted howl of wind against the outer wall. "How did you know? How did you know to build this way?" Willa considered her answer. She could have spoken about Maine, about the winters of her childhood, about the lumber camps, about Caleb, about the bunkhouse roof. All of it was true. All of it had contributed to the cabin that now sheltered 12 people. While Ruth Party lay under a snowdrift 4 miles south, she chose the version that contained all the others. "I didn't know this exact winter would come. I knew bad winters existed. I'd seen them. I watched my husband die under a roof that everyone said was good enough. In a lumber camp in Wisconsin. A roof that had held for 3 years. It failed on the 4th year because the 4th year was worse than the first 3. Nobody planned for the 4th year. They planned for the average." She paused. "I don't build for the average. I build for the worst I can imagine, then hope I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, I've wasted effort. If I'm right, I've kept people alive. You were right. I wish I hadn't been. Being right means the worst came. I'd rather have been wrong. I'd rather this winter was normal. My cabin was excessive. Your wife was alive." The words hung between them, carrying more weight than any defense of her construction methods could convey. She had not built the fool's fort to prove a point. She had built it to prevent a repetition of loss. The loss had come anyway, not to her, but to the man standing in front of her, the man whose wife might be alive if he had built different walls. Party said nothing for a long time. Then he walked to a corner of the cabin, sat down with his back against the warm logs, closed his eyes. He stayed for 2 days. He spoke very little. He ate what was offered. He slept when exhaustion overtook him. On the 3rd morning, he returned to his own cabin, to the chores of solitary survival, to the snowdrift where his wife lay waiting for spring. Before he left, standing in the airlock, his coat pulled tight against a cold that awaited him outside, he looked at Willa one final time. "I'll be back. Not for shelter. To help. Whatever you need done." He walked south into the snow. That night, Willa sat alone by the dying fire while 12 people slept around her. The woodpile had diminished to a level that could no longer be ignored. She had perhaps 3 weeks of fuel remaining if she maintained current consumption. If the winter broke by mid-April, that would be enough. If it did not break by mid-April, the cabin that had sheltered everyone, the cabin that had justified every dollar spent, every hour invested, every insult absorbed, would become a cold box. Warmer than the outside, certainly. The sawdust would retain residual heat for days even without fire, but not warm enough. Not for 12 people. Not for survival. She looked at the fire. She looked at the sleeping faces lit by its glow. She looked at the walls she had built with her own hands. Log by log, stone by stone, joint by joint. She had built the strongest structure on the prairie. She had saved lives that would have been lost without it. None of that mattered if the wood ran out before the cold did. One of the sheltering families stirred. A man named Colton, whose claim lay 12 miles west, who had arrived with his wife in early February, after their cabin's roof partially collapsed under snow weight. He had been watching Willa count wood for days. He had done his own arithmetic. His question was quiet, almost apologetic, the tone of someone who knows the answer but needs to hear it spoken. "Do we have enough?" Willa stared into the coals. The fire needed another log. She reached for one, placed it carefully, watched the flames accept it, curl around it, begin the slow consumption that converted wood into heat, heat into survival, survival into another hour, another night, another day subtracted from winter's account. "We'll have enough." Her voice carried something beyond certainty, beyond hope. Something closer to a promise made to the fire itself, to the walls, to the sleeping people who trusted their lives to a cabin that everyone had called a fool's fortress. She did not know if the promise was true. She only knew she would keep it. The firewood lasted until the first week of April. Then it didn't. Willa had tracked the decline, the way a doctor tracks a fever, daily measurements, daily adjustments, daily recalculations of a trajectory that refused to bend toward hope. Each morning, she counted the remaining logs in the indoor woodbox. Each evening, she counted again, subtracting the day's consumption, projecting forward against a winter that showed no sign of releasing its grip. The numbers told a story she could not rewrite. 12 people burned wood faster than one person stockpiled it. The math had been inevitable from the moment Henry Fisk knocked on her door in January. Every life she sheltered shortened the fuel supply by a fraction. Every fraction accumulated. By late March, the towers of split cottonwood that had once filled the space between cabin, along with barn, had shrunk to a single row, waist-high, perhaps 10 days' worth, at the reduced burn rate she had imposed over the previous 2 weeks. She had already begun rationing in mid-March, cutting the fire to half its normal intensity, banking the coals earlier at night, allowing the cabin temperature to drop below the comfortable warmth that had distinguished it from every other structure on the prairie. The difference was subtle at first. The people sheltering inside noticed a slight chill in the corners farthest from the fireplace. Then the chill crept closer. By the last week of March, the temperature inside the cabin, while still vastly warmer than the killing cold outside, had cooled to the point where breath occasionally fogged, where sleepers pulled their blankets tighter, where the youngest child asked why the fire was smaller than before. Nobody asked the question directly. Not after Colton had raised it. Willa's answer, delivered with a conviction that exceeded her certainty, had settled the matter publicly. But privately, in the glances exchanged between adults, when Willa was not looking, in the way hands lingered near the fireplace, as though memorizing the warmth while it lasted, the question lived. The wood was running out. Everyone could see the diminished pile. Everyone could do arithmetic. On April 2nd, Willa made her decision. She rose before dawn, dressed in every layer she owned, stepped through the airlock into a world that remained frozen, hostile, indifferent to the calendar's insistence that spring had arrived 2 weeks earlier. The temperature hovered near 10 below. The snow, compacted by months of accumulation, supported her weight as she walked to the barn. What remained of the barn? The structure still stood, its walls intact, its roof bearing its load of snow. But it no longer served its original purpose. The horse was gone, dead since February. The feed was gone. The barn was an empty shell, a collection of lumber arranged in the shape of usefulness, but containing nothing useful except itself. She studied the structure with the eye of someone who had built it, who knew every joint, every beam, every board. The walls were single-thickness logs, 8 inches in diameter, serviceable but not elegant. The rafters were adequate, the roof boards rough-cut. The door frame was the sturdiest component, built to withstand the horse leaning against it during storms. All of it was wood, all of it could burn. She went back to the cabin. Samuel Pardee had arrived the previous evening, keeping the promise he had made in March, returning not for shelter but to help. He slept on the stone floor near the south wall, his coat folded beneath his head, his body thinner than it had been in August, but carrying a different kind of strength now, the strength of a man who had lost everything except the capacity to be useful. Willa touched his shoulder. He woke instantly, the reflex of someone accustomed to sleeping in uncertain conditions. She did not need to explain. He had been watching the woodpile too. They worked through the morning, the two of them, dismantling the barn in temperatures that made the axe handle painful to grip even through gloves. Pardee attacked the roof first, clearing snow, then prying boards loose with a crowbar Willa had purchased in Elk Bend the previous summer. Each board came free, with a crack that echoed across the silent prairie. Willa worked on the walls, knocking logs free from their notches, rolling them through the snow toward the cabin. The work was brutal. The cold fought them at every step, numbing fingers, stiffening joints, sapping energy faster than the spare rations they had eaten for breakfast could replenish. By midday, half the barn was down, pile of lumber, boards stacked on logs, stacked on beams, sat in the trampled snow between the barn's remains along with the cabin door. Enough fuel for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if burned carefully. Willa stood over the pile, breathing hard, her face raw from cold, her hands aching inside gloves that had gone stiff with frozen sweat. She was looking at the ruins of something she had built. The barn had taken 6 days in September. She remembered the particular satisfaction of fitting the door frame, of hanging the door on iron hinges, of leading her horse inside. For the first time, the animal's hooves clicking on the packed earth floor. She had built the barn for a purpose. Now she was destroying it for a different purpose. Construction for survival. Destruction for survival. The frontier did not distinguish between the two. It only asked whether you were still alive at the end. Hardy worked beside her, without speaking. He understood what the barn's demolition meant because he had lived through his own version of it, burning furniture in October, burning shelving in November, burning the frame of his wife's sewing box in December. Each object consumed, carrying its own small history, its own investment of time, its own connection to a life that was being dismantled, piece by piece, to fuel another hour of existence. He had burned the past to survive the present. Now he was helping Willa do the same. They hauled the lumber inside by afternoon. The cabin's interior, already crowded with 12 occupants, plus their bedding, cooking equipment, water containers, dried food stores, now accommodated stacks of rough barn wood along 2 walls. The room smelled of pine sap, of snow, of the particular mustiness of old lumber exposed to cold. The smell was the smell of reprieve, temporary, finite, but real. That evening, Willa fed the fireplace with a barn rafter. The wood caught quickly, drier than the cottonwood she had been burning, seasoned by 6 months of Dakota winter, into a fuel that produced sharp, clean heat. The cabin temperature rose for the first time in weeks. People near the fire relaxed muscles they had been holding tight for days. The youngest child in the group, a girl of 3 belonging to Colton's family, laughed at the brightness of the flames. The sound startled everyone, not because it was loud, but because laughter had become unfamiliar, a relic of a season that existed only in memory. The barn wood bought time, but time was the only commodity that mattered now, because the winter had entered its final negotiation with the people trying to survive it. Every day the fuel lasted was a day closer to thaw. Every day closer to thaw was a day closer to the railroad running again, to supplies arriving, to the temperature rising above the threshold, where fire became a comfort rather than a necessity. The question was whether the fuel would outlast the cold, whether the barn Willa had built in 6 September days contained enough combustible material to bridge the gap between the last cord of firewood already burned along with the first warm day that had not yet arrived. April crawled forward, the 5th, the 8th, the 12th. Each day the sun rose slightly higher, stayed slightly longer, cast slightly more warmth onto the frozen prairie. The snow began to change character, losing the dry powder consistency that had defined it since October, becoming heavier, wetter, denser. It was still snow. The temperature still dropped below 0 most nights. But something had shifted in the architecture of the season, a structural crack in winter's foundation that was slowly, imperceptibly widening. On April 15th, water dripped from the cabin's roof for the first time since the previous October. A single drop, falling from the edge of the sod layer, where the sun's angle had warmed the surface just enough to melt the outermost crystals of ice. The drop fell onto the trampled snow below the eaves, making a tiny crater. Willa watched it fall. She watched the next one. She watched a third. She did not react visibly. She did not announce it to the people inside. But something released in her chest, a tension she had carried so long, she had forgotten it was there, a tightness around her breathing that had accumulated imperceptibly over 7 months of cold, of responsibility, of solitary calculation against diminishing resources. The drip was small. The drip was everything. Water falling from a roof meant the sun was winning. Slowly, grudgingly, in increments measured by single drops, but winning. The barn wood ran low by April 16th. 2 days of fuel remained, perhaps 3, if Willa reduced the fire to embers. She considered her options. The cabin itself contained wood, door frames, shutters, the inner door of the airlock, shelving she had built along the north wall. She could burn the cabin's own components, feeding the structure to itself, consuming the house from the inside to maintain warmth for its occupants. The irony was not lost on her. She had built the strongest cabin on the prairie. Now she contemplated burning pieces of it to survive the final days of a winter that had defeated everything except these walls. She did not have to make that choice. April 18th, morning. Willa woke to a she did not immediately recognize. Not wind, not the creak of settling logs, not the breathing of sleeping people. Something else. Something from outside, muffled by the double walls, filtered through the sawdust insulation, reduced to a whisper that reached her ears more as vibration than as noise. She lay still, listening. The sound continued, rhythmic, persistent, growing incrementally louder. Dripping, not the single occasional drops of 3 days ago. Continuous dripping. A steady percussion of water, falling from every surface that the sun could reach, falling from the roof, from the eaves, from the snowbanks piled against the walls, falling in streams that merged into rivulets, that carved channels in the compacted snow. She rose, she dressed, she opened the inner door, then the outer door. She stepped outside. The air was different, still cold, perhaps 20 degrees above zero, but 20 above zero was 50 degrees warmer than the nights of January. The sun, rising in a sky that for the first time in months showed patches of blue between the clouds, cast shadows, actual shadows with defined edges, onto snow that was visibly diminishing. The drifts that had reached the cabin's eaves now showed their internal structure, layers of storm upon storm, rendered visible as the outer surface retreated. Bare ground appeared in patches on south-facing slopes, dark earth exposed to sunlight for the first time since October, steaming faintly as moisture evaporated from soil that was beginning the long process of thawing. The prairie was not yet free. Miles of snow still covered the land. The creek was still frozen, though dark cracks in the ice suggested movement beneath. The road to Elk Bend, if a road could be said to exist beneath 6 feet of packed snow, remained impassable for wagons. But the direction of change was unmistakable. Winter was not ending. Winter was retreating. The distinction mattered because endings are events, while retreats are processes. Slow, contested, reversible in the short term, but inevitable in the long arc. Willa stood outside her cabin, feeling the sun on her face with an intensity that transcended temperature. She had not felt the sun as warmth since September. For 7 months, the sun had been a pale disk that crossed a gray sky, providing light without heat, illumination without comfort. Now it pressed against her skin with actual thermal force, faint but real, the first physical evidence that the world beyond winter still existed. She cried. Standing in the snow, alone outside the cabin, with water dripping from the roof behind her, with patches of dark earth emerging on the hillside above, with a blue sky opening overhead, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. The tears came quietly, tracking down cheeks that were chapped from cold. Dropping from her jaw onto the snow below, she cried the way a person cries when a weight they have carried so long, it became part of their body is finally set down. Not from sadness, from the sudden lightness of release. She had held 12 people alive through the worst winter in memory. She had shared her food, her fuel, her warmth, her cabin. She had calculated rations at midnight while others slept. She had dismantled her own barn for firewood. She had reduced her fire to embers, enduring the creeping cold in a cabin built to be warm, sacrificing comfort to extend survival by another day, another week. She had done all of this without complaint, without visible fear, without allowing the people who depended on her to see the doubt she carried. Now, alone with the dripping water, with the patches of earth, with the blue sky, she permitted herself the fear, the exhaustion, the loneliness of being the person everyone relies on, the person who answers every question with confidence. She does not possess. The person who says enough when the honest answer is, I don't know. The tears lasted perhaps 2 minutes. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, took a breath of air that tasted of spring beneath its residual cold, turned back toward the cabin. There were people to feed, a fire to tend, days of winter still to survive before the season fully turned. But the turn had begun. She knew it now. They would make it. 1 week later, on April 25th, the sound of a train whistle reached Elk Bend for the first time since December. The railroad crews had fought through the final miles of snow-covered track with a desperation born of knowing that people at the other end were starving. The locomotive pushed through drifts that had defeated it. 4 months earlier, the snow softer now, wetter, yielding to force that it would have laughed at in January. Behind the engine, freight cars carried flour, sugar, coffee, kerosene, salt, pork, dried fruit, medical supplies. The cargo manifest of civilization, the inventory of everything that separated a functioning town from a collection of people slowly dying in isolation. People gathered at the depot. Those who could walk came on foot through the slushy streets. Those too weak to walk were carried. Some stood in silence, watching the train with expressions that combined relief, gratitude, disbelief. Others wept openly. A few cheered, their voices hoarse, cracking, the sound of joy produced by throats that had spent 7 months conserving energy rather than expressing emotion. The supplies were distributed. Not sold, not at first. The storekeeper, a man named Pratt, whose shelves had been empty for 3 months, simply handed out flour, coffee, sugar to anyone who appeared at his counter. He would settle accounts later. For now, the point was sustenance. The point was the cup of real coffee that a woman held in both hands, eyes closed, breathing the steam, tasting something she had not tasted since January. The point was the flour that would become bread that did not taste of ground wheat husked in a coffee mill. The point was the kerosene that would fill lamps, pushing back darkness that had ruled the evenings since the supply ran out in February. But for many, the train arrived too late. The count would take months to finalize. Homestead records at the Territorial Land Office told the story in numbers stripped of human grief. The number of active claims in Dakota Territory dropped by 28% between October 1880 along with October 1881. Some of that decline represented death, settlers who froze in inadequate shelters, who starved when supplies ran out, who succumbed to diseases that a milder winter would have allowed them to fight off. Most of the decline represented surrender. Families who survived the winter but could not face another one. Families who packed what remained of their possessions, boarded eastbound trains, returned to the states they had come from, carrying stories of a winter that sounded like exaggeration to anyone who had not lived through it. Willa's cabin stood through the thaw, the way it had stood through the winter, solid, undamaged. Its double walls shedding meltwater, the way they had shed cold, its stone foundation unmoved by the freeze-thaw cycle that cracked lesser foundations, its massive fireplace cold now by choice rather than by necessity. The structure required no repair. The logs showed no rot. The chinking held firm. The cabin had been designed for endurance. It endured. The people who had sheltered there dispersed as the snow retreated. Colton took his family back to his claim, where his partially collapsed cabin awaited repair or replacement. The single drifter moved on, headed west, carrying the story. Others returned to Elk Bend, to relatives, to the slow process of rebuilding lives that the winter had dismantled. Samuel Pardee did not leave. He stayed through April, working alongside Willa as the snow melted, as the ground emerged, as the scope of winter's damage became visible. Dead livestock dotting the prairie, preserved by cold, now beginning the decomposition that spring demanded. Fences destroyed. Outbuildings collapsed. Haystacks consumed. The infrastructure of settlement, built over the previous 2 years of mild weather, largely erased. Pardee's own claim, 4 miles south, still held his cabin. The structure Ruth had died in. He visited it once in late April, riding a borrowed horse through mud that sucked at the animal's hooves. He stood in the doorway, looking at the interior, the single-thickness walls, the fireplace that had never produced enough heat, the bed where Ruth had lain, where he had held her, where she had stopped breathing sometime before dawn on a February night, so cold that the tears on his face had frozen before they reached his jaw. He closed the door. He rode back to Willa's claim. Through May, Pardee helped Willa plant her first crop. Late, barely within the growing season's window, but possible. They broke sod together, Pardee driving a borrowed plow while Willa guided the horse another settler had lent them. The work was hard, the ground reluctant, still half frozen in places, yielding grudgingly to the blade, but it yielded. Seed went into the earth. Wheat, mostly. Some corn. A kitchen garden near the cabin. The claim was becoming a farm, 7 months behind the schedule Willa had originally planned, but alive, growing. Party began rebuilding in June 1882. Not on his old cabin site. He could not face that structure. Instead he chose a new location on the eastern portion of his property, a spot with better drainage, partial shelter from the northwest wind. He consulted Willa on every detail: foundation depth, log diameter, corner joint technique, wall thickness. He built double walls. He ordered sawdust from Dutch Brennan's mill, paying in advance this time, no credit needed. He packed the insulation himself, compressing each layer the way Willa had taught him, eliminating air pockets, creating a continuous thermal barrier between interior warmth along with exterior cold. He built a stone fireplace with a chimney that extended well above the roof peak. He installed a glass window with double shutters. He constructed an airlock entry with 2 doors. The construction took him 3 months. 3 months where a standard cabin would have taken 3 weeks. Neighbors who visited, settlers who had survived the winter in their own damaged cabins, watched Pardee work with expressions that contained no mockery. The jokes had been silenced by 7 months of cold. Nobody called this construction wasteful. Nobody called it foolish. Nobody said anything at all except to ask questions. How thick should the sawdust be? How deep should the foundation go? Where do you find logs straight enough for dovetail joints? When the cabin was finished in September 1882, Pardee stood before it with Willa beside him. The structure was solid, well-proportioned, built with the care of someone who understood that every joint, every chink, every inch of insulation represented a decision that might one day determine whether the person inside lived or died. Pardee looked at the cabin for a long time. His voice, when it came, carried the roughness of a man not accustomed to expressing what lay beneath his practical exterior. I built the cabin. I should have built the first time. I just wish I'd done it before it mattered. Willa said nothing. There was nothing to say. The wish was universal across Dakota Territory. Every settler who had survived the winter carried the same retrospective understanding that the choices made in summer determined the outcomes suffered in winter. That by the time you knew your walls were too thin, it was too late to thicken them. She did not say "I told you so." The phrase would have been accurate. It would also have been cruel. Directed at a man whose wife had died behind walls, he now understood to be insufficient. Willa was not interested in cruelty. She was not interested in vindication. She was interested in the fact that if another hard winter came, Samuel Pardee would survive it. That was the point. That had always been the point. Reverend Amos Tull invited Willa to the church in Elk Bend that autumn, not to worship, though she was welcome for that. To speak. New settlers had been arriving, fewer than the previous year's flood, but still coming, drawn by the land, by the opportunity, by the stubborn American belief that free acreage was worth any risk. These newcomers needed to understand what the territory could do. They needed to hear it from someone who had survived the worst of it. Willa stood before the congregation on a Sunday afternoon in October 1882. She had never spoken to a group. She was not comfortable with attention, not comfortable being looked at by faces that expected wisdom. She spoke for perhaps 15 minutes. She did not tell the story of her cabin. The story had already spread through the territory, carried by the people she had sheltered, embellished by the people they had told, transformed from a simple account of good construction into something approaching legend. She did not need to repeat it. Instead, she talked about walls, about what walls were for, about the difference between a wall that kept out the weather you expected versus a wall that kept out the weather that was possible. She talked about shortcuts, about the cost of saving time, measured not in dollars but in vulnerability. She talked about firewood, about how the amount that seemed excessive in October became insufficient by March. She spoke plainly, without rhetoric, without drama, in sentences stripped to their essential meaning. The congregation listened the way people listen when the speaker has earned the right to be heard through something more convincing than eloquence. When she finished, settlers approached her individually. They asked specific questions. How thick should walls be? What material works best for chinking? How much firewood constitutes a safe supply? She answered each question with the patience of someone who understood that information shared was insulation distributed, that every cabin built stronger because of her advice was one more family protected from the next hard winter whenever it came. She never charged for the advice. She never refused a visitor who came to examine her cabin, to study the construction, to measure the gap between her walls. The cabin itself became a teaching tool, a physical demonstration of principles that words alone could not convey. Settlers would stand between the inner wall, along with the outer wall, separated by 3 feet of compressed sawdust, running their hands along both surfaces, feeling the temperature difference, the understanding in their bodies what their minds had grasped only as abstraction. The cabins built after 1882 looked different from those built before. Thicker walls became common. Stone foundations appeared where cornerstones had previously sufficed. Chinking improved, applied in multiple layers, checked after drying, reapplied where cracks appeared. Firewood storage expanded from modest stacks to massive reserve. The casual attitude toward winter construction, the attitude that had prevailed during the mild years of the 1870s, that attitude vanished. It was replaced by something more serious, more thorough, more respectful of what the climate could deliver. Nobody explained the change. Nobody needed to. In the spring of 1883, a carpenter from Pennsylvania arrived in Dakota Territory. His name was Emmett Voss. He was 34, methodical, skilled with tools in ways that went beyond the rough competence of most frontier builders. He had heard about the cabin from a newspaper article published in Omaha, a brief account of the hard winter that mentioned, in a single paragraph, the homesteader whose double-walled cabin had sheltered dozens. The article did not name Willa. It referred to a widow near Elk Bend, whose construction methods had become a model for the territory. Voss was interested in the construction, not the story. He traveled to Elk Bend, asked directions, rode 20 miles northwest to Willa's claim. He arrived on a June morning, dismounted, walked around the cabin, examining every visible detail with the focused attention of a professional assessing a peer's work. The dovetail joints, the stone foundation, the double wall gap, the chimney construction, the roof layers, each element received his scrutiny, measured against the standards of Eastern construction that he carried in his mental catalog. He knocked on the door. Willa opened it. She saw a man with carpenter's hands, sawdust in his eyebrows, a measuring rule protruding from his breast pocket. She recognized the type. Caleb had been the same kind of man, the kind who evaluated structures before people, who noticed the angle of a door frame before the face of the person standing in it. Voss asked if he could see the interior. Willa stepped aside. He entered, spending 20 minutes inside, examining the wall joints from the inner side, the fireplace construction, the stone floor, the shuttered window. He asked technical questions, specific questions about the sawdust density, the chinking composition, the log seasoning process. Willa answered with the same factual directness. She applied to everything. He stayed for dinner, then for a week, then for the planting season. By autumn, the arrangement had become permanent in everything but name. They married in October 1883, in the same church where Willa had spoken to the congregation a year earlier. Reverend Tull performed the ceremony. Samuel Party attended, standing in the back row, his face carrying an expression that combined happiness for Willa with the private grief that never fully left him. The marriage was not a rescue. Willa did not need rescuing. It was a partnership between two people who understood the same principles, who valued the same qualities in construction, in character, in the approach to an uncertain future. Emmett brought skills that complemented hers: finer joinery, experience with frame construction, knowledge of Eastern building techniques that could be adapted to prairie conditions. Willa brought the knowledge that had saved lives, the understanding of extremes that no amount of technical skill could replace. They raised 6 children in the cabin. 6 children who grew up within double walls, who played on a stone floor, who fell asleep to the sound of fire, crackling in a massive stone hearth. The cabin that had been designed for solitary survival became a family home, its spaces adapted, its purpose expanded, its essential character unchanged. Willa proved up her claim in 1885, gaining full legal ownership of the 160 acres she had staked 5 years earlier. The certificate from the land office carried her name, Willa Crenshaw Voss, officially documenting what the territory had long since recognized informally. The land was hers. The cabin was hers. The reputation was hers. Old-timers told the story to newcomers. When settlers arrived fresh from the east, full of optimism, eager to build quickly, to start farming, to make their fortune on free land, someone would always mention the cabin. That widow who built the Fool's Fort, 20 miles northwest of Elk Bend. Double walls packed with sawdust. Survived the hard winter when everything else failed. Sheltered dozens of people. Go look at it if you want to understand what you're building for. The nickname persisted, but its meaning inverted. The Fool's Fort had been coined as mockery. Over the years, it became a title of respect. The way a scar becomes a badge. The way a difficulty survived becomes a credential. People spoke the name with a particular emphasis that conveyed not derision but admiration. Dakota Territory became South Dakota in 1889. Cosset, admitted to the Union with the infrastructure, the institutions, the population necessary for statehood. The homestead era continued, but its character changed. The raw desperation of the early 1880s gave way to something more established, more supported, more connected to the networks of commerce, transportation, communication that gradually transformed frontier into society. Winters remained harsh, but communities had learned. Construction had improved. Supply chains had strengthened. The isolation that had made the hard winters so deadly diminished. With each mile of railroad laid, each town incorporated, each telegraph wire strung, the memory of the hard winter did not diminish. The old-timers never let it. They told their children, who told their children, who told theirs. The stories varied in detail but converged on the same truths. Prepare for the worst. Build more than you think you need. Stock more than you think you'll use. Trust your own judgment when everyone disagrees. The stories were not historical curiosities. They were survival instructions, dressed in narrative, transmitted across generations, the way seed stock was transmitted across seasons. In 1920, a newspaper reporter from Pierre traveled to Willa's claim to interview her for an article commemorating the 40th anniversary of the hard winter. Willa was 71 years old. Her hair had gone white. Her hands, still strong, bore the topography of a life spent building, planting, raising children, working the land that she had claimed when she was 31 alone, with nothing but savings, a death certificate, a set of skills she had learned in lumber camps, memories of cold that had shaped every decision she made. She sat on the porch Emmett had added to the cabin in 1892, an improvement to the original structure that provided shade in summer, a buffer against wind in winter. The reporter, a young man named Aldrich, who had been born in 1895, 15 years after the winter he was writing about, sat across from her with a notebook on his knee. He asked how it felt to have been proven right after being called a fool. Willa's answer came without hesitation, as though she had considered the question long before it was asked. Perhaps had been considering it for 40 years. I wasn't trying to be right. I was trying to stay alive. If everyone else had been right, if the winter had been normal, my cabin would have been too much. Wasted time. Wasted money. People would have kept calling me a fool. I'd have kept being alive. The way it happened, they were wrong. I was right. I survived while many didn't. I'd rather have wasted effort than lost life. She paused. I'd rather have been wrong. Being right meant the worst came. Nobody should want that. Aldrich wrote quickly, capturing the words, sensing their weight. He asked what advice she would give to young people building homes. Willa looked out at the prairie, at the land she had worked for 4 decades, at the horizon where sky met earth in a line so clean, it looked drawn with a ruler. Her voice, when she answered, carried the clarity of someone who had distilled a lifetime of experience into a single principle. Build for the worst winter that could happen. Not the worst winter that has happened. Those are different things. The worst winter that has happened, you already know about. You can look it up. You can measure it. The worst winter that could happen, nobody knows about yet. You have to imagine it. Use your imagination. Build for what you imagine. The cabin stood for 70 years. 70 years of South Dakota weather, of blizzards with heat waves, of droughts with floods, of the full range of conditions the Great Plains could generate. It stood through the winter of 1888, which killed over 200 people across the territory. It stood through the dust storms of the 1930s. It stood through every test the climate delivered, performing the function it had been designed to perform, as some Kenshin, sheltering the people who lived within its walls from conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely lethal. In 1000 Ikpes, 950, the Voss family, Willa's grandchildren now, built a modern house on the property. The old cabin was no longer needed. 3 bedrooms, indoor plumbing, electric heat, the comforts of mid-century American life, comforts that Willa, who had died in 1932 at the age of 83, had never experienced but had made possible by proving up the claim that kept the land in the family. The cabin came down slowly, deliberately, with a respect that demolition rarely receives. The family dismantled it log by log, reversing the process Willa had followed 70 years earlier. When they opened the walls, exposing the gap between inner structure along with outer, the sawdust spilled out, dry clean, still smelling faintly of pine. 70 years of compression had not degraded it. The logs showed minimal rot. The dovetail joints remained tight. The stone foundation was intact, unmoved by 70 cycles of freeze plus thaw. The construction had been so sound that engineers who examined the materials estimated the cabin could have stood another 70 years with basic maintenance. Pieces were preserved. The main door, the double-thickness plank door that had opened for Henry Fisk on a January night in 1881, was donated to the Heritage Museum in Pierre. Several logs were saved, displayed at the Dakota Territorial Museum, with a placard explaining their origin. The massive hearthstone, the 3-foot boulder Willa had spent an entire day dragging from the creek bed with log rollers, was placed at the original cabin site as a marker. A historical plaque, installed by the State Historical Society, tells the story in condensed form. The family still owns the land. They still allow visitors. Descendants of those who sheltered in the cabin during the hard winter have made pilgrimages to the site, standing on the grass where the cabin once stood, touching the hearthstone, reading the plaque. Historians studying frontier survival visit. Builders interested in traditional construction techniques examine the preserved logs in museums, noting the precision of the dovetail joints, the quality of the wood selection, the evidence of bark removal done immediately after felling. Each visitor learns some version of the same lesson, a lesson first demonstrated by a cabin built in 1880 by a woman everyone called a fool. They called it the Fool's Fort. Then it survived the harshest winter in recorded American history. In surviving, it taught a lesson that carried across generations, across the transition from territory to state, from frontier to society. Build not for what you expect, but for what is possible. Prepare not for the likely outcome, but for the one you hope never arrives. When others mock your caution, let them mock. Their opinions will not keep you warm when the temperature drops past the point where opinions matter. Only walls will keep you warm. Only preparation will keep you alive. Only the courage to follow your own judgment, when everyone disagrees, will produce a structure strong enough to stand when standing is the difference between survival along with everything else. The cabin stood. The people sheltered there survived. The woman who built it was called a fool until the winter proved her wise. The stories, carved in sawdust, mortared in stone, carried in the memory of everyone who heard it, stills warm.